It hurt, but my uncle said it had to be that way. The parents turned pale upon hearing the little girl's confession, so they decided to place a hidden recorder in her backpack, and when they heard what the uncle was doing to her, they were petrified. There are moments in life that mark us forever, some with happy memories, others with invisible wounds that never heal. But there is one fear in particular that is the cruelest of all, the one that hides deep within the mind, ready to strike when you least expect it. For Lena, water was her worst nightmare, a silent enemy lurking in the most unexpected moments. The scorching sun bathed the golden sand, and the laughter of children floated through the air, mingling with the sound of waves crashing against the shore. Lena ran barefoot, her small feet sinking into the hot sand as she clutched a red bucket in one hand and a blue shovel in the other. Her crystalline laughter rose above the murmurs of the beach. That day, happiness felt eternal. Daniel, her father, waved at her from under the umbrella, camera in hand. Lena, come here, I want to take a picture of you with Mommy. Clara, her mother, dressed in a light white dress, watched her with pride. Lena ran toward them, jumping as if each step were part of a game. Daddy, Mommy, I'm going to build the biggest castle in the world, she announced with a dazzling smile. Clara ran her fingers through her brown hair, pushing back a few sticky strands from her forehead. But don't go too far into the water, sweetheart. Stay where we can see you. Yes, yes, Lena replied with the impatience of children who can only think about their next great adventure. She ran back toward the shore, sinking her hands into the damp sand and beginning her masterpiece. She was so focused on her castle that she didn't notice the waves creeping closer and closer to her feet. The sea breeze grew stronger, and the sky, which had been a bright blue just moments ago, was now turning gray. Lena felt the water brush her fingers and laughed. But her laughter died in her throat when a sudden, powerful wave crashed into her. The red bucket floated away as the current pulled her, giving her no time to react. The icy water swallowed her feet, then her legs, and in an instant, the suction was so strong that she felt herself being dragged deeper. Lena opened her mouth to scream, but salty water flooded her throat, burning from the inside. Her arms flailed desperately, but the sand beneath her feet had vanished. From the shore, Clara and Daniel jumped to their feet. Lena, Clara screamed, her heart about to explode in her chest. The little girl saw her parents' faces blurred by distance, heard their screams as if they came from another world. Everything felt far away. The current tossed her violently, and for a moment, only panic existed. She tried to swim, but her body was too small, too weak. The water swallowed her whole. Darkness. The sound of her own breath turned into bubbles rising to the surface, floating away from her. Her body sank deeper and deeper. She felt her chest burning, her mind screaming at her to breathe, to fight. And then, hands grabbed her. Strong arms yanked her out of the water in a swift pull, dragging her back toward the shore. Lena coughed, her small body convulsing as she spat out salty water. The blinding sunlight made her squint, and when she finally focused her vision, she saw the silhouette of a man in a lifeguard uniform. "Breathe, little one. Breathe," the stranger said, his voice firm but reassuring. Clara knelt beside her, tears streaming down her face. "My love, you're okay? You're okay." Lena didn't speak. She just clung to her mother with all her strength as her tiny body trembled uncontrollably. Something inside her broke that day. Something that would never be the same again. Days passed, but Lena was no longer the same. She didn't want to bathe, didn't want to wash her hands. Just the sound of running water in the shower made her shiver and cry. Clara and Daniel tried to comfort her, to explain that water wasn't bad, that the bathtub wasn't the ocean. But Lena refused. I don't want to, she sobbed every time they tried to take her to the bathroom. The nightmares came soon after. In the middle of the night, Clara would hear her screaming and run to her room. Lena would wake up drenched in sweat, her breathing ragged. "The water took me, Mommy. I don't want to go back." Clara would hold her close, whispering soothing words, but deep down, she knew her daughter was trapped in a fear that wouldn't disappear easily. Months passed, and Lena not only avoided water, but something else began to change in her. Her energy slowly faded. Her games became shorter, her runs less frequent. She no longer raced through the house laughing, no longer begged to play at the park for hours. She tired quickly, her legs seemed to lose strength, and her body felt heavier. Clara noticed it first. She watched her daughter trip more often, struggled to catch her breath after playing. Daniel tried not to panic, but when he saw Lena sitting on a park bench while other kids ran around, his heart sank. She's growing up. Maybe she's just in a quieter phase, he tried to reassure Clara one night in bed. No, Clara whispered, staring at the ceiling. Something is wrong. The fear grew when Lena started complaining about back pain. Not with words, but with gestures of discomfort, with strange postures when she sat. Her physical endurance crumbled, as if something inside her was fading away. Clara didn't hesitate any longer. She took her to the doctor. The doctor examined her carefully, asking her to perform a few movements. Lena tried, but grew exhausted quickly. Has she always been this weak? The doctor asked, adjusting his glasses. No, Clara answered immediately. The doctor frowned and studied some x-rays. He turned to Clara and Daniel with a serious expression. Your daughter has a curvature in her spine and muscle weakness in her legs, he explained firmly. Clara felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. Swimming would be the best option for her, the doctor continued. The water will allow her to strengthen her muscles without the risk of injury. Lena, sitting on the examination table, looked at her mother with frightened eyes. I don't want to swim, Mommy. Clara stroked her hair and kissed her forehead. Don't worry, my love. We won't. But that night, lying in bed beside Daniel, she knew she was lying. We can't give up, she murmured into the darkness. Daniel sighed. Then what do we do? Clara closed her eyes tightly. There was only one person who could help. Someone she had sworn never to see again. Hours later, with the phone in her hand, her thumb trembled over the screen. The number was still there, saved in her contacts, untouched for years. Her breathing became unsteady. In the end, she forced herself to dial. The phone rang several times. Then, a deep, cold voice answered. I never thought you'd call me again after everything. Clara swallowed hard. I need your help. A long silence. Then, the response. Is it about the girl? Clara's chest tightened. Yes. Another silence. Tell me where and when. Clara closed her eyes. She knew she was making a decision that could change everything. Bruno was back in her life. And she wasn't sure if that was a good thing, or the worst mistake she could make. The air was thick with an invisible tension as Clara held the phone in her hand, still unable to believe she had dialed that number. Her breathing was slow, restrained, as if she feared that with each word spoken, something inside her would break even more. On the other end of the line, silence stretched. Then, Bruno's deep, monotone voice sounded again, this time with a hint of weariness. Tell me where and when. Clara swallowed hard. She looked at Daniel, who was watching her in silence from the table, his fingers intertwined on his lap. There was no turning back. Tomorrow. At our house. The call ended with a sharp click. Clara remained motionless, the screen still lit in her hand, as if hoping that the decision she had just made could be undone by simply thinking about it. Daniel leaned forward and rested his elbows on the table, his eyes cautiously searching for his wife's. Are you okay? Clara let out a low laugh, but there was no humor in it. No, I'm not okay. Daniel sighed and stood up, walking toward her. He gently took her hand, but she didn't return the gesture. If there's something I need to know about him, his voice lowered, this is the time. Clara felt her chest tighten. She knew Daniel was waiting for her to give him a reason, a concrete explanation for the unease that surrounded her whenever Bruno's name was mentioned. But she couldn't. Not now. It's not that simple. Daniel didn't push. Instead, he gave her hand a light squeeze and let go. We'll see how things go tomorrow. The doorbell rang at exactly 10 o'clock the next morning. Lena, who was sitting in the living room with her doll in her hands, lifted her head with curiosity. She wasn't expecting visitors. Clara felt her stomach clench and the skin on her arms prickle for no apparent reason. She took a deep breath before walking to the door and opening it. Bruno stood in the doorway, his expression neutral. He hadn't changed much since the last time she had seen him, but there was something about him that made him seem different. Maybe it was the unkempt beard, or the way his posture didn't seem to belong to any particular place. He carried a black backpack over one shoulder and wore a long-sleeved gray t-shirt that contrasted with the warmth of the weather. Clara's eyes met his. Dark, indecipherable. "Come in," she said, her tone devoid of courtesy. Bruno stepped inside without a word. His gaze swept across the house as if measuring every corner. Then, his attention settled on Lena. The little girl looked at him with a mix of curiosity and caution. She wasn't used to seeing strange men in her home. But what stood out to her the most wasn't his presence, it was the way her mother was looking at him. As if she didn't know whether she wanted him there or not. "Are you Uncle Bruno?" Lena asked softly, without moving from the couch. Bruno tilted his head slightly and studied her for a few seconds before answering. "That's what they say." The girl frowned and turned her head toward her mother, as if waiting for confirmation. "Yes, sweetheart. He's my brother." Bruno let out a short, hollow laugh. "That's what they say too." Daniel appeared from the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He offered one to Bruno, who took it without gratitude, but also without disdain. Daniel remained standing next to Clara, feeling this same discomfort floating in the air. "Lena needs help. She's afraid of the water," Clara said in a dry tone. "But I don't want to pressure her. I don't want this to make her feel worse." Bruno nodded and placed the cup on the table without even tasting it. "I understand. I don't want you to use any harsh or aggressive methods," Clara continued. "Don't force her to do anything she doesn't want to do." Bruno smirked slightly and crossed his arms over his chest. "I'm not a torturer." Clara clenched her jaw. "I just want you to help my daughter. Nothing more." Bruno didn't respond immediately. His gaze locked onto Clara's in a way that made Daniel tense up. Finally, Bruno gave a barely perceptible nod. "Some wounds don't heal with time, Clara. But let's do this for Lena." A shiver ran down Clara's spine. She wasn't sure if it was because of the way he said it or because those words seemed to carry a hidden meaning that only the 2 of them understood. Lena watched them in silence, sensing that something else was happening between the adults in that room. Something she didn't understand, but that hovered over them like an invisible shadow. "Are we going to the pool now?" the girl asked, breaking the tension. Bruno looked at her. His expression shifted slightly, as if he could be a little more human with her. "Yes, let's go." An hour later, the sports complex was empty at this time of the afternoon. The pool reflected the light from the lamps on its surface, creating dancing waves that reflected off the surrounding walls. Lena stood next to her mother, staring at the water with an expression that oscillated between fear and curiosity. Bruno left his backpack on one of the benches and knelt next to Lena, watching her closely. "You're not going in today." Lena looked at him in surprise. Her eyes widened a little more. "No." Bruno shook his head. "No. We're just going to be here. I want you to look at the water. To smell it. To hear how it sounds when someone touches it." Lena gulped and looked at her mother for approval. Clara just nodded slightly, not intervening. Bruno sat on the edge of the pool and dipped his feet in the water, never taking his eyes off the little girl. "Come. Sit here." Lena hesitated. But something about the way he said it, without pressure, without obligation, made her fear feel a little smaller. He cautiously approached and sat down beside her, though keeping some distance. His feet dangled above the surface. "The water won't hurt you from here," Bruno said quietly. "You can touch it if you want." Lena looked at her own hands, then at the pool. She bit her lower lip and extended the tip of a finger, barely touching the surface. She shuddered a little, but didn't pull her hand away right away. Bruno didn't say anything. He just watched her. "It doesn't seem so bad, but it's a little weird," Lena whispered after a few seconds. Bruno let out a light laugh. "Yeah, it's weird at first." Clara, watching from the bench, felt something twist inside her. There was something about the scene that was unsettling, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. Maybe it was the fact that for the first time, Lena was touching the water without screaming. Maybe it was the way Bruno was looking at her, as if he understood something that no one else did. Daniel approached his wife and put an arm around her shoulders. "It's working," he murmured. "Maybe he can really help her." Clara didn't answer. Her eyes remained fixed on Bruno and Lena, on the way the girl looked at her uncle with a mixture of doubt and fascination. For the first time, Lena was not only beginning to feel curious about the water, but about this man who, until a few hours ago, was a complete stranger to her. And that idea was both a relief and a threat. A few days later, Lena's relationship with water slowly began to change. At first, she only watched the pool, touched the water with the tips of her fingers, let her feet get used to the feeling of the cold surface surrounding them. There was no pressure, no demands. Bruno was patient, and although his methods were unusual, they seemed to be working. Lena no longer cried at the sight of the pool. She no longer trembled when she heard the splashes of other swimmers. Something inside her was beginning to change, though she didn't yet know exactly what. Bruno made her laugh with games that seemed to have no purpose, but without realizing it, they were drawing her closer to the water. He asked her to touch the surface and describe how it felt, to blow bubbles with her mouth while he held her hand. He never pushed her beyond her limits, but he always found a way to help her move forward without her noticing. Lena began to trust him. For some reason, her uncle didn't make her feel afraid. Clara, however, did not share the same enthusiasm. From the very first session, her discomfort had only grown. She sat in the bleachers, arms crossed, watching Bruno's every move with an expression that barely concealed her distrust. Daniel tried to reassure her, telling her she had to give him a chance, that so far, everything was working better than they had imagined. "I don't know what bothers me more," Clara muttered one night as she cleared the dinner table. "That it's working, or that it's him making it work." Daniel looked up from his newspaper and frowned. "Are you ever going to tell me what happened between you two? Or are you just going to keep waiting for me to figure it out?" Clara pressed her lips together. Her husband had never asked her directly before, though she knew the question had been eating away at him. For years, Bruno's presence in her life had been a forbidden subject. But now that he was back, that barrier was crumbling. "It's not something I want to remember," she said quietly. Daniel sighed but didn't press further. He no longer expected his wife to tell him the whole truth. He only hoped she knew what she was doing. Days passed and Lena grew more comfortable in the pool. She no longer just touched the water. Now, she dipped her feet in without fear, and Bruno had even convinced her to hold onto the edge and move her legs as if she were swimming. The idea of sinking still terrified her, but it was no longer an absolute impossibility. Her fear had become something she could manage. During one of their sessions, Bruno sat beside her at the edge of the pool, staring at the water in silence. Lena copied him, watching the lights ripple across the surface. "Sometimes secrets make us stronger," he said suddenly. Lena tilted her head, confused. "What do you mean?" Bruno turned to look at her, wearing that expression that always seemed to hide something deeper behind his words. "The things we keep to ourselves help us grow. They make us different from everyone else." Lena thought about that for a moment. She wasn't sure she fully understood what he meant, but something in his voice made her feel like she should listen. "Do you have secrets, Uncle?" Bruno gave a small smile. "We all do." Lena fell into thought, feeling the idea of secrets curl around her mind. They weren't bad, right? Everyone had them. Maybe she could have one too. That night, after dinner, Clara noticed that her daughter was quieter than usual. Lena didn't talk about her training with her usual excitement, and when her mother asked how her lesson went, the girl hesitated before answering. "It was fine," she said simply. Clara narrowed her eyes and leaned toward her with a soft smile. "Just fine? Nothing special happened today?" Lena stirred her spoon around in her soup. "Bruno says secrets make us stronger." Clara's body tensed immediately. She tried to stay calm, but a sharp alarm rang inside her. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Lena looked up and, for a moment, seemed unsure. Then, she shrugged. Nothing. It's our secret. The spoon in Clara's hand trembled slightly. Her heart began to race. Lena, what kind of secret? The little girl frowned, as if realizing she had said something she wasn't supposed to. Just a game. Clara didn't believe for a second that it was just a game. Daniel, who had been silent until then, decided to step in. Lena, in this house, we don't keep secrets from each other, okay? Lena looked confused but nodded slowly. Then, without saying another word, she went back to her soup. A chill ran down Clara's spine. She looked at her husband and saw the same worry reflected in his eyes. Later, once Lena was asleep, Clara sat on the couch next to Daniel and let out a long, restrained sigh. Lena has never kept secrets from me. Why now? Daniel didn't answer right away. He knew what his wife was implying, and no matter how much he tried to rationalize it, there was something unsettling about all of this. I'll talk to Bruno, he finally said. Clara shook her head. No, I will. Daniel held her gaze. Clara, if you're hiding something about him, now is the time to tell me. She looked away. I just want to make sure Lena is okay. Daniel didn't press further, but something about the way she avoided his eyes told him this conversation wasn't over. Bruno was already waiting at the pool when Clara arrived the next day. There was no one else there. The fluorescent lights cast a cold glow over the water, and the sound of her footsteps echoed through the empty space. Bruno didn't even turn when she approached. He knew she was there. Lena is making progress quickly, he said without preamble. Clara crossed her arms and looked at him, her expression tense. I'm not here to talk about that. Bruno slowly turned to face her. A shadow of a smile flickered across his face. Then, what are you here to talk about? Clara clenched her jaw. I don't like you talking to her about secrets. Bruno raised an eyebrow. It's a way of teaching her to trust herself. Clara felt a shiver creep down her spine. There was something in the way he said it that made it feel like he was implying much more than just his words. She knew something wasn't right. The night had grown heavy, filled with thoughts that seemed unable to find their place in Clara's mind. She sat at the edge of the bed, staring at her phone screen without really seeing it. Her conversation with Bruno kept replaying in her head, like an echo that wouldn't fade. Something in his tone, in the way he responded to her, unsettled her. She didn't like how he played with his words, how he planted doubts without having to say much. She had learned long ago that Bruno never said anything without a hidden intention. Daniel appeared in the doorway, his brow furrowed, arms crossed. He didn't need to ask what was bothering her. He could see it on her face, in the way her body remained tense, as if she were locked in a constant internal battle. You can't keep doing this, Clara, he said in a calm voice. You can't keep doubting everything. She slowly lifted her gaze and looked at him with a coldness that caught him off guard. What if you're right? What if I'm overreacting? Clara said, trying to sound as composed as she could. But what if I'm not? Daniel let out a long sigh and stepped closer, sitting down beside her. I know your relationship with Bruno is complicated, he said, with the cautious tone of someone who knows they're treading on dangerous ground. But so far, Lena has been fine with him. You don't know that, Clara shot back immediately. We don't know what happens in those sessions. Daniel studied her in silence for a few seconds. What are you thinking? Clara lowered her eyes to her phone, unlocked it, and started searching for something. I'm going to buy a microphone, she said without hesitation. A small one. We'll put it in Lena's backpack. Daniel blinked, surprised by what he had just heard. You want to spy on them? Clara lifted her gaze, her eyes filled with determination. I want answers. He ran a hand over his face, exhaling in frustration. This is too much, Clara. If Lena finds out we're recording her. She won't find out, Clara interrupted. We're not spying on her. We're spying on him. Daniel watched her closely. He knew there was no changing her mind. Not when she clung to something with this kind of intensity. Tell me this isn't just because of what happened between you two, he whispered. Clara felt a knot tighten in her stomach. It's not about that, she replied without looking at him. It's about Lena. Daniel sighed again. Then do it. But if the recordings don't show anything suspicious, I want you to stop doubting your brother. Clara didn't make any promises. The next morning, Lena's backpack carried something new, hidden in one of its smallest compartments. A tiny wireless microphone, barely visible between the folds of fabric. Clara made sure it was properly placed before zipping the bag closed as naturally as possible. "Ready for your lesson, sweetheart?" she asked with a smile. Lena nodded as she finished fastening her shoes. "Yeah, Uncle Bruno said we're doing something new today." Clara felt a shiver run down her spine, but her smile didn't waver. "Something new?" Lena nodded enthusiastically. "But I can't say what it is." The words hit Clara like a punch to the gut. "Why can't you say?" The girl looked at her with an expression that was a mix of confusion and something else Clara couldn't quite identify. "Because it's a secret," she whispered, as if revealing something forbidden. The knot in Clara's stomach tightened even more. "We're running late. Let's go," Daniel cut in, trying to end the conversation before his wife pushed further. Clara took Lena's hand, and they left the house, her heart pounding in an uncontrollable rhythm. That night, after Lena had fallen asleep, Clara and Daniel sat in front of the computer with their headphones plugged in. The recording file was ready to be played. Daniel looked at his wife with something close to doubt before pressing play. The first voices they heard were other kids in the locker room, laughter, and insignificant chatter. Then, Bruno's voice emerged clearly. "Come on, Lena. Ready to give it a try?" Clara's heart pounded. "Yes," Lena's voice responded, sounding more confident than Clara had expected. There was a sound of splashing water, and then Bruno spoke again. "You're stronger than you think, Lena. Trust yourself." Clara felt a chill. Not because of the words themselves, but because of the way he said them. The next parts of the recording were similar. Bruno encouraging her, motivating her to move in the water, to trust her own body. There were no screams, nothing suspicious, just a normal training session. Daniel took off his headphones and looked at her with a raised eyebrow. That was surprisingly reassuring. Clara didn't respond. She played the audio again, searching for something, anything that would confirm her suspicions. But she found nothing. "Maybe. I was wrong," she murmured, not entirely convinced. Daniel patted her hand. "I told you, you were worrying too much." Clara wasn't sure if she should feel relieved, or even more uneasy. Later that night, Clara walked into Lena's room and sat on the edge of her bed, gently running her fingers through her hair. "Did you like your lesson today, sweetheart?" Lena nodded without opening her eyes. "Yes," Clara smiled softly. "That's good. I'm glad you're feeling better." A long silence followed. Then, in a voice so quiet that Clara barely caught it, Lena whispered, "I can't tell them. They would never understand." Clara felt the hairs on her arms stand on end. "What did you say, sweetheart?" Lena didn't answer. Her breathing was steady now, as if she were asleep. But Clara knew she wasn't. And now, more than ever, she was certain that something was very wrong. The night felt darker than usual. Clara sat at the edge of Lena's bed, watching her daughter's silhouette in the dim light of the room. Her breathing was calm, but her words still echoed in Clara's mind. "I can't tell you. You'd never understand." That whisper had been almost imperceptible, but the weight of those words left Clara unsettled. Lena had never spoken like that before. She had never kept secrets. She had never felt the need to hide anything from her or Daniel. Something was happening. Clara slipped out of the room silently, closing the door softly, as if a sudden movement could shatter the fragile calm of the house. She walked into the kitchen and found Daniel, who was watching her with exhaustion. "You need to let this go, Clara," he murmured, resting his elbows on the table. Clara pressed her lips together and shook her head. "No, not until I know what's going on." Daniel let out a sigh, running his hands over his face. "Listen, we heard the recording. There was nothing strange. Nothing that suggests Bruno is doing anything wrong." "That's what worries me," she replied, crossing her arms. "Everything sounds too good. Too perfect." Daniel looked at her with frustration. "So what are we supposed to do? Keep spying on him? Push Lena until she says something we want to hear?" Clara looked away. "I'm going to find the truth," she whispered. Daniel said nothing more. He knew he wouldn't be able to stop her. Lena kept improving in her swimming lessons. Every day, her confidence in the water grew. She could now float on her own, glide smoothly, and according to Bruno, she would soon be able to swim without fear. But something was wrong. Clara could see it in her daughter's eyes, in the way she sometimes avoided eye contact when asked about her training. There were nights when she seemed distant, as if her mind were trapped in a place Clara couldn't reach. And then came the sentence that changed everything. It happened after a swimming lesson. Lena was in her room, changing clothes, while Clara folded some towels near the bed. The girl sat on the mattress, deep in thought, and without looking up, she murmured something. It hurt, but Uncle said it had to be that way, that the pain is normal. Clara dropped the towel. Her heart stopped. "What?" Lena looked up, startled. "Nothing," she said quickly. "It doesn't matter." Clara felt a chill run through her skin. She knelt in front of her daughter and gently took her hands. "What hurt, sweetheart?" Lena bit her lower lip and looked away. "Nothing, Mom. It was just in the pool." Clara felt her breathing become unsteady. "What did Bruno do?" Lena frowned. "Nothing bad, Mom. He just said that sometimes your body hurts when you learn something new." Clara felt her blood turn cold. "Where did it hurt?" The girl hesitated, then shrugged. "My legs, my arms, but it's okay. Uncle Bruno said it's normal." Clara forced a smile. "Of course, love. It's normal when you exercise." Lena nodded, relieved that her mother wasn't pressing further. But Clara wasn't relieved. At that very moment, she knew she had to do something. Bruno arrived at the house 2 days later. Clara had told him to stop by for coffee after Lena's training. It was the perfect excuse. He showed up in his usual workout clothes, a black backpack slung over his shoulder. His expression was the same as always, impassive, analytical, as if he could read people's intentions before they even spoke. "Where's Lena?" he asked as he walked in. "She's resting," Clara replied, not taking her eyes off him. "It was an intense lesson, wasn't it?" Bruno tilted his head slightly. "She's progressing fast. She's strong." Daniel entered the living room, crossing his arms as he observed his brother-in-law with a hard stare. "Coffee?" Clara offered. Bruno nodded and placed his backpack on a chair. This was her chance. While Bruno was distracted by Daniel, Clara moved quickly. She walked over to the table, her hands trembling as she slipped her fingers into his backpack, searching for his phone. She found it. Carefully, she took it out and quietly slipped into the kitchen. Her palms were sweaty as she tried to unlock it. Bruno wasn't careless. There was no easy code to guess. But Clara knew his mind. She tried several dates. None worked. Until she entered the date of their mother's death. The screen unlocked. Clara felt her stomach tighten. She quickly scrolled through the apps, looking for something, anything. There were deleted messages. Empty spaces in conversations that should have been complete. She felt her breath hitch. She opened the gallery. At first, everything looked normal. Photos of the pool, of training sessions. But then she found a hidden folder. Her thumb trembled as she tapped the screen. The folder opened. What she saw made her drop the phone. It hit the floor with a dull thud. Her breathing turned erratic. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. She couldn't process it. "Clara." Bruno's voice came from the living room. Clara felt her legs weaken. "What are you hiding, Bruno?" Her brother appeared in the kitchen doorway. His eyes dropped to the phone on the floor. His expression changed. Darkness. Shadows. Something in his gaze hardened, turning cold and unreadable. "You have no idea what you're saying." Clara felt her chest tighten. Daniel appeared behind Bruno, his confused expression shifting to concern when he saw his wife's face. "Clara, what's wrong?" She couldn't speak. She couldn't move. But Bruno could. He bent down, picked up his phone, and slipped it into his pocket. "I think it's best if I leave." Daniel stepped forward. "No, you're going to explain what's going on here." Bruno smiled. But it wasn't a kind smile. I have nothing to explain. Daniel looked at Clara, waiting for a response. She swallowed hard. If you're right, Daniel murmured, then Lena can't see him again. Bruno sighed. You're making a problem where there isn't one. Clara felt rage burn in her throat. I don't want you near Lena anymore. Bruno stared at her for a long moment. Then he gave a small smile. That's not up to you. And with that, he left. Clara felt the air in the house grow suffocating. Daniel placed his hands on her shoulders. Clara, what did you see? She closed her eyes. I can't explain it. Daniel stared at her intently. Then we can't wait any longer. Lena won't see him again. Clara nodded. But deep in her mind, a voice whispered that this wasn't over. It had only just begun. The silence in Clara and Daniel's house was suffocating. Ever since Bruno had crossed the door and disappeared into the darkness of the night, the sense of danger had lingered in the air. Clara hadn't spoken a single word since then. She just sat on the couch, arms crossed over her chest, as if trying to contain the trembling in her hands. Daniel, standing by the window, stared out onto the street, his jaw clenched, as if expecting to see Bruno's silhouette reappear at any moment. The next morning, Clara's phone vibrated on the table. She looked at the screen, feeling a knot tighten in her throat. It was a message from the pool administrator. Ma'am, your daughter didn't show up for training today. Is everything okay? Clara's pulse skyrocketed. She shot up from her seat, feeling her stomach clench. What is it? Daniel asked, noticing her expression. Lena, Clara whispered. She's not at the pool. The tension in the air turned into a bone-chilling cold. Daniel grabbed his phone and immediately dialed Bruno's number. Clara felt the blood pounding in her temples with each ring. Nothing. He called again. Nothing. Daniel looked at her, his face pale. We have to find her. The car sped down the road. Clara gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Daniel kept dialing Bruno's number over and over, his jaw locked, his eyes burning with fury and fear. He has her, Clara murmured, feeling the words scorch her throat. Daniel didn't contradict her. There was no other explanation. When they arrived at the pool, Clara barely waited for the car to stop. She jumped out of her seat and ran inside, Daniel close behind her. Lena, she called out desperately. The pool manager looked at them, startled. Ma'am, I thought you had. Clara didn't hear him. She kept moving forward. The water in the pool was still. There was no one there. Daniel ran to the locker room. He searched the lockers, checked every corner. Nothing. Clara felt the air escape her lungs. She's not here, Daniel murmured, his voice laced with desperation. Where's my daughter? Clara screamed, her voice echoing through the empty space. Then a noise. A soft creak. The sound of a door opening. Clara whipped her head around. And she saw her. Lena was standing on the other side of the pool at the entrance of a training room. But she wasn't alone. Bruno was behind her. Relief was fleeting. Because something was very wrong. The way Lena stood, her arms stiff at her sides. Her eyes, wide and glistening, locked onto the floor. Her lips pressed tightly together, as if holding something back. Clara ran to her and grabbed her shoulders. Lena, sweetheart, are you okay? Lena didn't answer. Her breathing was uneven. Her hands were shaking. Mom, she whispered in the smallest voice Clara had ever heard. Daniel stepped between Bruno and them, his body rigid, ready for anything. What the hell did you do, Bruno? Bruno didn't look troubled. He didn't even look nervous. I just wanted to help her, Clara. Clara felt anger and fear merge inside her, turning into something uncontrollable. Help her. She disappeared without a word. No one knew where she was. Bruno tilted his head. Lena called me. She wanted to talk. Clara's fists clenched. What did you do to her? Bruno gave a hollow smile. Nothing she didn't want. Clara's world froze. The echo of those words hit her like a hammer. Lena trembled in her arms, looking devastated. Daniel lunged at Bruno, grabbing him by the collar of his shirt. If you ever come near my daughter again, I swear I'll... "Don't touch me," Bruno replied, his voice disturbingly calm. Clara felt terror consume her. "We're leaving," she said, her voice strangled. She grabbed Lena's hand and pulled her away from the pool. Daniel followed, still shaking with fury. No one spoke on the way home. No one knew what to say. At home, Clara led Lena to her bedroom. She sat her on the bed, gripping her hands desperately. "Lena, sweetheart, tell me what happened." Lena didn't look at her. "Nothing. Lena, please." The girl swallowed hard. Her fingers clutched the bedsheet, twisting it in her grip. "I can't tell you. I can't." Clara felt desperation claw at her chest. "Yes, you can. I'm here. You don't have to be afraid." Lena shut her eyes tightly. Her lips trembled. Uncle Bruno said, "There are things you can't tell." Clara felt her breath catch. "What things?" Lena shook her head. "If I say it, everything will fall apart." Daniel appeared in the doorway, his eyes full of unease. Clara couldn't let this go. "Lena, sweetheart, please tell me the truth." Lena bit her lip hard. Clara waited. And then, Lena broke down. She curled in on herself, her sobs shaking her small body. "I didn't want to do it, but he said I had to." Clara wrapped her arms around her tightly. "Tell me what happened." The little girl gasped between sobs, trying to speak. "It hurt, but he said it had to be that way." Daniel shut his eyes, his face twisting in anguish. Clara felt her skin turn ice cold. "What did he do to you, Lena?" Lena sobbed harder. "He said I had to trust him." Clara felt her world collapse around her. "Tell me the truth." Lena lifted her gaze, her eyes filled with tears. And then, she said it. And the truth was worse than anything Clara could have ever imagined. Lena clung tighter to her mother, her small body shaking with sobs. "He said I wasn't supposed to tell anyone." Clara felt her chest tighten under unbearable pressure. "Why?" Her voice trembled, as if she feared the answer. "Why did he tell you that?" Lena closed her eyes, her breath unsteady. "Because you didn't say anything either when you were little." Clara's world froze. Her daughter's words stabbed into her chest like a sharp knife. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. Memories began to surface from the corner of her mind where she had buried them years ago, a place where shadows had gathered undisturbed. Her father. The dark hallway of the house. The closed doors. Bruno, crying in silence. Her, watching from the crack of her door. The sound of muffled sobs of broken pleas. The fear crawling over her skin. And her silence. She had stayed quiet. Years later, when Bruno tried to speak, when he told her that their father did things to him that he didn't understand, she looked away and pretended she hadn't heard. Because the fear was too great. Because if she acknowledged it out loud, she would have to accept it. Because admitting it would have meant destroying everything she knew. So she ignored it. She left him alone. And over time, Bruno stopped trying. The air in the room became unbreathable. "No," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "It can't be." Lena looked at her, eyes shining with tears, unaware of the weight of her own words. Daniel took a step forward, his face pale and tense. "What is she talking about?" Clara couldn't answer. Daniel grabbed her arm, shaking her in desperation. "Clara, tell me the truth." Clara felt reality collapsing around her. But she couldn't say it. She couldn't put words to something that had been buried for so long. Daniel let her go, stepping back as if he had just realized he didn't know her at all. "I'm going to find him," he said in an icy voice. Clara reacted immediately. "No!" Daniel looked at her with fury. "You're still protecting him?" "I'll talk to him," Clara said firmly. "I'll do it." Daniel closed his eyes in frustration. "If you're not back in an hour, I'll go myself." Clara nodded. But deep inside, something told her this conversation with her brother would be the hardest of her life. Bruno opened the door to his apartment without surprise. "I knew you'd come." Clara walked in without asking for permission. The place was almost empty. Just a few old pieces of furniture and a table covered with scattered papers. Bruno closed the door behind her and watched her with a neutral expression. Why did you do it? Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Bruno tilted his head as if he didn't understand the question. I didn't do anything. Clara felt the pain in her chest intensify. Lena told me you talked to her about things she couldn't say. That you went through the same thing when you were a child. Bruno said nothing. Clara felt her breathing becoming erratic. All this time, Bruno looked at her with something she couldn't decipher. You knew. The words hit her like a punch. Bruno, you saw me. His voice was low, almost emotionless. You heard me. You saw our father abusing me. And you did nothing. Clara felt shame burning her skin. I was just a child. So was I. Silence stretched between them. Clara swallowed hard. Why did you never tell me again? Bruno let out a bitter laugh. Because I realized it didn't matter. No one was going to do anything. Clara felt the tears burning in her eyes. You don't know how much I regret it. Bruno stared at her. You can't change the past. But I can do something now. Bruno crossed his arms. Why did you call me, Clara? Why did you decide to reach out after all these years? Clara closed her eyes. Because I knew you were a natural coach. I knew Lena needed someone like you, and because, deep down, I think I needed to ask for your forgiveness. Bruno looked at her with a mix of disbelief and something darker. Forgiveness? Clara nodded. For not speaking up. Bruno sighed and ran a hand over his face. I don't want your forgiveness, Clara. I want Lena to never go through what we went through. Clara felt the weight of his words crushing her soul. Is that what you were trying to do? Bruno nodded slowly. Lena is strong, but I didn't want her to learn to stay silent. Clara let out a strangled sob. Is that all that happened? Bruno looked at her coldly. That's all. Clara studied him carefully. She saw no lies in his eyes. But she saw something else. Something that could never be repaired. Bruno grabbed his backpack and slung it over his shoulder. I don't want to see you again. Clara felt the world closing in around her. But she couldn't say anything. She turned and walked out of that apartment with a shattered heart. Months later, Lena quit swimming. Bruno disappeared from their lives. Clara never told Daniel the truth about her brother. Time passed, but the scars remained. Some things can't be forgotten. You just learn to live with them. What did you think of this story? Let us know in the comments, what would you do in a similar situation? We invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends or family as a way to show your support. This motivates us to keep bringing you exciting stories almost every day. Don't miss the next captivating narrative that's about to appear on your screen. We truly appreciate having you here with us. You can click on the links that are appearing on your screen right now. We have an exclusive selection of captivating stories and guaranteed entertainment, specially curated for you. See you in the next video. Take care.